Manchuria was once a part of China? Well, what if it wasn't? That's what happened in 1931, thanks to Japan. This video is sponsored by Starbucks Frappuccinos and 24-Hour Fitness. The grind never stops. Now for some context. Leading up to Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the Pacific Island nation was slowly gaining power in mainland Asia. In 1895, Japan completely annexed the Korean peninsula, and after the Paris Peace Conference that ended World War I, Japan seized previously owned German land in China such as Dalian and Qingdao. With a direct border between the two countries now, Japan's imperial ambitions turned to the Chinese.
Yet, what may be more important to their invasion was what's on everybody's mind.
Money!
The Great Depression in 1929 left Japan with slowing exports and a failing economy, allowing the rise of militant nationalism, creating a military fascist faction. Also, China offered more land to an overpopulating Japan, which hoped to utilize this new land for its agriculture and mineral deposits. By 1931, Japan had invested large sums into the South Manchuria Railway Company, and they kept a large army in southern Manchuria to guard their investments. This army acted without the consent of the Japanese government.
Yet, while Japan may have been an ever-growing military power in the Pacific, the Chinese were quite the opposite. Across China, a civil war was raging on, one that would last for almost half a century. Since the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, the Chinese Kuomintang Party, the KMT for short, and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, not to be confused with college and career planning, had been locked in an ideological feud. However, the fall of the Qing dynasty led to warlords all over China and revived a feudal-like system throughout. In order to unite the country, the CCP and KMT banded together in the First United Front and together reconquered China under a somewhat unified government, but a communist attempt to relocate the capital to Wuhan in 1927 dissolved this unification.
Chiang Kai-shek, also known as Jing Jishi, was the KMT leader, and under his orders the CCP was purged from Shanghai and attacked. This prompted protests from the CCP, and as one thing led to another, soon the CCP was in full revolt and civil war had begun. Between 1927 and 1931, fighting continued with the KMT heavily winning, while the CCP owned only a small portion of southern China. It was at this time that the USSR began to take interest in the CCP, as they began to supply the group and install the new group of leaders, the 28 Bolsheviks, as the CCP executive.
So, what triggered Japan's attack? Well, it all officially started with the Mukden incident in September of 1931. Japan started the war by purposefully setting explosives on the railway, blowing it up, and blaming China. Japan invaded with around 60,000 men, conquering China within a few months. But what was their response? To say the least, it wasn't good, because they were locked in a civil war in the south of China. Most of the KMT troops weren't anywhere near Manchuria, and those that were there suffered heavy losses in the first fights with the Japanese. Realizing he couldn't win both wars, Chiang banned his troops from fighting with the Japanese, practically resigning Manchuria. He was nowhere near ready for total war with the Japanese. Besides, China wasn't completely united after the whole Qing dynasty incident, and so Manchuria was still very autonomous from the central government, and many local leaders willingly joined the Japanese cause.
However, those who resisted in spite of Chiang Kai-shek's orders were regarded as heroes. General Ma Za-shan was one such leader, as he rose to superstar status after being heavily idolized in the press and inspired anti-Japanese volunteer armies. Yet, as the Nanjing government in China collapsed to the Civil War, all remaining troops in Manchuria retreated back to the Great Wall, and the Japanese reinstated the old King Emperor Pu Yi as the Japanese de facto leader in Manchuria, now called Manchukuo.
During the whole affair, the Chinese KMT government called upon the League of Nations. Being weak and without power, all the League could really do is say, "Hey, stop it, Japan, that's not good." And Japan were like, "No, it's okay, don't worry." However, what the League did do is establish a neutral zone between the now Japanese-owned Manchukuo and normal China after the invasion. Yet, it did little to install peace. Werner Gruhl, a historian and author, argues this half-hearted reaction by China and Chiang would lead to China's imminent weakness in Japan's second 1937 invasion.
Between the invasion of Manchuria and 1937, the two nations continued to have little skirmishes until the first part of the Sino-Japanese War, which began July 7, 1937, and ended in 1941. It began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, a dispute between troops that escalated into battle. Overall, this war caused many casualties. The Japanese started with the war with 15,000 troops in China. Over 4 million Chinese and Japanese military personnel died from war-related violence, famine, and other causes, and 10 to 25 million Chinese citizens died. Japan at first succeeded in capturing Shanghai and Nanjing, but the battle soon crawled to a stalemate, with the Japanese slowly winning until 1941. So how did the Chinese respond? It was pretty hard for them to respond because the KMT had both the civil war with the Chinese to deal with and the Japanese invasion. Chiang Kai-shek once said, "The Japanese are a disease of the skin. The communists are a disease of the heart." The Second United Front was China's main response. What was the Second United Front? It was when Chiang Kai-shek put Zhang Zhulang in charge of destroying the CCP. By 1937, the CCP, headed by Mao Zedong, was eager to resume cooperation with the KMT in order to defend China. As the war with the Japanese proved imminent, Chiang refused to prepare for war and cease fighting with the CCP, so Zhang kidnapped the president and forced him to do so. Historian Frank Dorn argues that the unwillingness of Chiang to fight with the communists throughout the war were his ultimate downfall. He even argues that China had the ability to win, stating the Japanese army was only modern for Asian standards, not world standards. And he also says the Japanese disunity between army and government led to weak command of troops. In Dorn's eyes, it was only Chiang's refusal to completely fight with the communists that led to their initial defeat. On the contrary, Dick Wilson, who wrote for the China Quarterly, views the Second United Front in a positive light, stating that while it was disorganized and often useless, it did just enough to unite China in the early parts of the war in order to stay afloat until Allied support arrived.
During the war, the two parties would try to outfight each other in an effort to gain the land from the Japanese for themselves. Another way the Chinese responded was with the 1938 Yellow River Flood, which was a flood created by China in order to slow down the rapid advances of Japanese forces. The Battle of Changsha in 1939 was the first of 4 attempts by Japan to take the city of Changsha. The Chinese defensive strategy was a war of attrition, the strategy to drag on the war as long as possible, wasting Japanese resources while building the Chinese military. A term to describe this strategy is winning by outlasting. Over 40,000 Japanese casualties forced Japan into withdrawal, and Changsha was the first major city to successfully defend against Japanese advances. This allowed the Chinese to prevent the Japanese from taking territories in southern China. The 1939 to 1940 Winter Offensive was the first major counteroffensive by the Chinese on multiple fronts. The objective was to utilize their position of exterior lines to prevent the Japanese from launching new local offensives or shifting their forces to concentrate for a large offensive. Although this failed to achieve its original objective, it shocked the Japanese forces and set them back nonetheless. Relations between the KMT and CCP broke down during this due to the CCP's attempt to move guerrilla troops behind enemy lines and absorb Japanese territory. Next, the new Fourth Army incident was when Chiang ordered the CCP army to retreat from Jiangsu province in January of 1941. On their retreat, the Chinese National Army attacked the CCP army, destroying them and weakening the CCP in central China. This led to the official dissolving of the Second United Front, and, for the rest of the war, the constant fighting between CCP and KMT.
On December 7th, 1941, however, the shape of the war changed dramatically as the superpower US joined the war as a result of Pearl Harbor. The Chinese were now officially thrown onto the Allied side with the UK, USSR, and the US. FDR even went on to call these countries the 4 policemen of the New World. With this new Allied support, China was funneled in limited supplies through Burma from British India.
With new allies, new supplies, and a new attitude, the Chinese were ready for a new military strategy. Do less. Chiang Kai-shek believed waiting for Allied support on mainland Asia was the best strategy, much to the disagreeance to Joseph Stilwell, an American general who advocated aggression by the Chinese. Chiang's unwillingness to fight the Japanese on land led to dissatisfaction from the Allies, who eventually adopted the strategy of island hopping to attack the Japanese rather than attacking through the mainland. Yet, historian David Pong advocates this as China's reason for winning. saying their success came from their ability to remain strong within their nation while dragging out the war, allowing the Japanese to suffer from immense casualties, such as the 40,000 in Changsha. Although Parks Kopel disagrees, stating China was actually a pretty useless ally all around, not even counting their Civil War struggles. For example, in Indochina, the UK asked for help from the Chinese, which Chiang rejected, seeing it as fighting for Europeans, not China.
Regardless of Allied strategies, however, as 1944 came and went, the Chinese army steadily gained ground against the Japanese as they now fought a two-front war. As the war closed, both the CCP and KMT scrambled to seize as much occupied land as possible, and the CCP ended the war with more land than it had originally started with. The party also got many more members. In 1937, the CCP membership was around 100,000. In 1945, membership was 1.2 million. The people of China began to believe more in the CCP as, in their eyes, they fought harder and longer for the country than the KMT. In 1945, as peace was reached in Asia, war wouldn't end in China, as a 3-year-long civil war would resume with Mao Zedong as the eventual victor.
So, in summary, Japan was like, I'm gonna take Manchuria. And China was like, no, I'm in civil war. And then they took it. And then Japan did it again, but this time China was like, I'm gonna fight you this time, united, but still lose and be in a civil war. Until the Allies saved China. And then after war with Japan ended, China was like, let's do civil war again.
The
end!
And now for a cover from Mulan's Reflection.
Someone I don't know. Somehow I cannot hide
When
who
will
I
my
am,
reflection-
though I've tried. When will my reflection show?
When will I